May 1979. Wangaratta, Victoria. A Sydney travel agent named Len Roden hires a single second-hand Denning coach from Hoys Roadlines, the Wangaratta company running buses since 1930. His business partner, Jeff McIntyre, runs Hoys. Together, they launch a weekly Sydney to Melbourne to Adelaide to Perth service against the two long-distance coach giants, Greyhound and Ansett Pioneer, with one bus. 11 years later, that one bus has become Australia's largest coach company. Nearly 200 coaches, over 900 staff, 50% of the national market. Offices in London, representation in New York, Auckland, Singapore, Tokyo. And then, at midnight on Tuesday, August 28, 1990, the entire fleet is rounded up to a single depot in Wangaratta, and the ANZ Bank moves in. 11 years from one hired coach to administration, owing roughly $100 million. The company that beat the giants destroyed itself. Chapter 1. The Sydney Travel Agent. To understand what happened on a Tuesday night in August 1990, you have to start in May 1979. That year, the Australian interstate coach market was carved up between two giants. Greyhound Australia, with origins reaching back to 1928, built into a national operator across half a century. And Ansett Pioneer, the long-distance coach division of Sir Reginald Ansett's transport empire, with origins in the Pioneer Tours Company, founded in 1932. Between them, they ran the highways, Sydney to Melbourne, Melbourne to Adelaide, Adelaide to Perth, Brisbane to Cairns. The country's long-haul coach business was a two-horse race, and the horses were stabled. A Sydney travel agent named Len Roden saw something they didn't. The biography of Len Roden from before 1979 is not in the open record. We have the man as he appeared in May 1979, a working travel agent in Sydney, running a small agency called Deluxe Travel. And we have his founding philosophy, recorded years later by the bus industry trade journalist Gordon Lowe. He had a simple philosophy, Lowe wrote, provide a safe and reliable service at the lowest possible fare. That was the entire business plan, cheaper than the giants, reliable enough to keep passengers, safe enough to keep regulators away. What Roden didn't have was a coach, or a depot, or a maintenance shed, or a fleet of drivers. What he had was a phone number and a partnership offer for a man named Jeff McIntyre. McIntyre was the general manager of Hoys Roadlines, a coach company that had been operating from Wangaratta in northeast Victoria since 1930. Hoys ran routes from Wangaratta to Shepparton to Bright to the Mount Buffalo Chalet, 49 years of regional coach experience. A depot, a maintenance facility, mechanics, drivers. Roden proposed a deal. Hoys would supply the bus, the driver, and the maintenance. Roden would supply the bookings, the route, the brand, and the fare strategy. Together, they would launch a weekly Sydney to Perth service via Melbourne and Adelaide. One coach, one driver, one run a week against Greyhound and Ansett Pioneer. McIntyre said yes. In May 1979, a single second-hand Denning coach was hired from Hoys and rolled out of the Wangaratta depot for its first commercial run. Gordon Lowe, who knew both founders, wrote later, "I met the directors on many occasions and must say that I had nothing but the highest respect and admiration for them." Lowe described the founding image as one bus slugging its way across the Nullarbor in 1979. The Sydney travel agent and the Wangaratta general manager had bought themselves a place in the long-distance coach business. If you watched our Dick Smith video, you saw a 24-year-old Sydney larrikin bet $610 against the electronics giants from a Neutral Bay car park in 1968. 11 years later, another Sydney entrepreneur bet a single hired coach against the coach giants. Different decade. Different industry. Same Sydney dare. Chapter 2. The Giants. To understand what Roden and McIntyre were taking on, you have to look at the road they were driving onto. Australia's long-distance coach industry was old, older than the country itself. Cobb and Company began running stagecoaches from Melbourne to the Victorian goldfields in 1853. At its 1880s peak, Cobb and Company harnessed 6,000 horses a day. By the time the last Cobb and Company coach ran in Queensland in 1924, the company had been transporting Australians across distances no railway could reach for 71 years. The mechanised era arrived in 1928, with the founding of Greyhound Australia. The Comer family acquired the brand and built it into a national operator through the post-war decades. By the 1970s, Greyhound ran the highways from Cairns to Perth. The second giant came from a different direction. In 1932, a Pioneer Tours company began operating in Adelaide, running tourist coaches into the South Australian outback. In 1965, Reginald Ansett's transport empire acquired Pioneer and rebranded it as Ansett Pioneer. By the late 1970s, Ansett Pioneer was the long-distance coach division of one of Australia's largest diversified transport conglomerates. If you remember our Ansett research, you'll recognise the diversification pattern. Sir Peter Aberles, who took over Ansett in 1979, the same year Roden hired his first coach, would within a decade diversify Ansett into 37 companies, many of them, in the Australian Aviation Archive's words, totally unrelated to aviation. The hubris pattern: build big, acquire wide, lose focus. It would rhyme with Deluxe Coachlines a decade later, in a different industry at a smaller scale with the same arithmetic. Between Greyhound and Ansett Pioneer, the long-distance coach industry was effectively closed. Constitutional Section 92 protected interstate trade from state regulation, which kept the routes legally open. But the fleet scale, the terminal access, the booking systems, and the customer base were locked up. To enter the market, you needed coaches, depots, brand recognition, and capital. You needed every one of the things Len Roden in his Sydney travel agency did not have. Coach travel mattered to ordinary Australians. Airfares were regulated under the two airline policy, in which Ansett and Trans-Australia Airlines were the only domestic carriers, with fares high and slots protected. Rail had been declining since the 1960s. For the family travelling Sydney to Adelaide for Christmas, or the backpacker doing the country end-to-end on a working visa, the coach was the only affordable national transport. Roden had spotted that market. Now he had to win it. Chapter 3, From One Coach to 50. The first run went well, then the next one, then the next. By October 1979, 5 months after that first Wangaratta departure, the Sydney-to-Perth service was running twice a week. The single Denning coach had become 3. A custom coaches-bodied RFW was added to the fleet. 2 more Domino coaches followed. The route extended. The bookings filled. Working-class families travelling east to west. Students going home for university breaks. Backpackers heading for the Western Australian gold mines. The demand was there, and Deluxe was undercutting the giants by margins that made the trip viable for households who had previously not travelled interstate at all. Roden's fare strategy was unsubtle. Greyhound and Ansett Pioneer charged what the market would bear. Deluxe charged less. When the giants matched, Deluxe cut again. The fare war ran from late 1979 through the early 1980s, and Deluxe kept growing through it. In 1981, 2 years in, Deluxe established its own maintenance facility at Wangaratta, ending the subcontract arrangement with Hoys. The company was no longer renting infrastructure, it was building its own. By 1985, 6 years from that first run, the network had crossed the continent. The Adelaide to Alice Springs service began that year, and with it Deluxe became something the giants had not seen before, a true national operator with no inherited assets, no government contracts, no rail corridor heritage. Just a Sydney travel agent's idea, a Wangaratta GM's expertise, and a fleet that had grown from one to dozens through nothing but undercutting the competition. The Stuart Highway, the Air Highway, the Hume, the Pacific, the Bruce. The roads that crossed Australia were now carrying Deluxe blue and white, weekly at first, then twice weekly, then daily on the eastern seaboard corridors. Sydney-Melbourne ran 21 return services a week by the end of the period. Brisbane-Sydney ran 21. Sydney to Adelaide ran 7. Gordon Lowe, looking back from 2006, described the founding image and the trajectory it produced in a single sentence. What began as one bus slugging its way across the Nullarbor in 1979 had become a multi-million-dollar industry leader with a fleet of coaches traversing the nation. If you watched our Kurnell video, you saw a refinery built by 3,000 workmen on a 174-hectare site over 5 years, infrastructure on a national scale, every brick paid for. Deluxe was the opposite case. No infrastructure, no state planning, no multinational parent, just one Sydney office, one Wangaratta depot, and a strategy of cutting fares until the customers came. By 1985, the customers had come. Deluxe was no longer the underdog. Deluxe was the operator the giants were watching. The 2-horse race was now a 3-horse race, and the 3rd horse was accelerating. Chapter 4. Way of Life. The men and women who drove the coaches, fixed the engines, and sold the tickets had a phrase for what they did. It wasn't on the recruitment material. It wasn't in the company's marketing copy. It survived into the Facebook reunion pages former Deluxe staff maintain to this day. Deluxe wasn't a job, one former staffer wrote, but a way of life. The driver who took the wheel of a Deluxe coach in Sydney at 6 p.m, ran the Hume Highway through the night, swapped at Wangaratta at dawn, and then drove the Adelaide leg through the next day was not in a normal job. The Sydney-to-Perth run took just over 3 days each way. The Adelaide to Darwin run took 2.5. Drivers ran in pairs. Coaches ran with 80 passengers behind them, eating from highway diners, watching the sunrise across paddocks they had crossed weekly for years. The blue and white livery, 2 shades of blue, white belt, distinctive enough to be recognised in a roadside roadhouse from a kilometre away, was Roden's design. It would survive the company. Even when Deluxe was gone, the colours would haunt Australian highways for years. But that comes later. For now, the texture of Deluxe in the mid-1980s was a Wangaratta depot at 3 a.m. with mechanics under the bonnets, a Sydney terminal at 5 p.m. with passengers boarding, a roadhouse in Port Augusta at midnight with drivers signing logbooks. The country's longest-haul transport workforce, in a country where the longest-haul work meant living a way that wasn't a job. We can't verify named long-serving drivers, mechanics or depot managers from the open record. The trade press of the 1980s did not name them. The Deluxe Coachlines reunion Facebook page, established by former staff after the collapse, is the strongest surviving repository. Gatherings were held at Albury in 1993 and Wangaratta in 2010. The 2015 documentary Deluxe Days, produced by Viewmark Films, gathered interviews the trade press of 1990 had not. Gordon Lowe recorded one observation the workforce data confirms: the way they treated their staff and their ability to focus on the job in hand. If you watched our Wunderlich video, you saw the Redfern terracotta works run on a craft culture, 60-year careers, named families across generations. Deluxe was the opposite scale, 11 years total. But the culture was the same, a workforce that wouldn't have called what it did a job. If you watched our Point Henry video, you remember the Alcoans, with an 18-year average length of service across 51 years. Deluxe built the same culture in 11. The cost of fast culture is the same as the cost of fast empire. Both can disappear in a single night. Chapter 5. Blue Ribbon Service. By 1988, the third horse had won. Wikipedia, drawing on the trade press and the company's own period reporting, records that Deluxe Coachlines was Australia's largest coach operator with a 50% market share operating across the country with nearly 200 coaches. Greyhound and Ansett Pioneer were now splitting the other half between them. Gordon Lowe, writing from the Trade Press archive, recorded the peak figures. Some 179 coaches and employed over 900 people Australia-wide and had its own offices in the United Kingdom, representation in the United States, New Zealand, Singapore and Japan. The Wikipedia info box for September 1990 lists the fleet at 193. The Blue Ribbon Service slogan was on the side of every coach. A Sydney travel agent and a Wangaratta general manager had become a continent-spanning operator. The peak year had a specific cause. World Expo 88 ran in Brisbane from April 30th to October 30th, 1988, drawing more than 18 million visitors over 6 months. For a long-distance coach company with an established Brisbane terminal and a national network, Expo 88 was the cash bonanza of the decade. Visitors from interstate riding to Brisbane on Deluxe. Visitors from overseas connecting through Australian capital cities. Brisbane Gold Coast day tour traffic. Sydney-Brisbane corridor running 21 return services per week. Adelaide-Brisbane runs full from May to October. The Expo 88 surge produced the revenue. The revenue produced the confidence. The confidence produced the next decision, which is what this story turns on. If you watched our Cotties video, you saw the General Foods deal in 1966 lock in 3 decades of prosperity for a Sydney brand that had spent its first half-century clawing its way up. Cotties peaked under American ownership before the cordial business folded back into commodity packaging. If you watched our Dick Smith video, you remember the Woolworths years. Dick Smith Electronics under Woolworths' wing, expanding from a single neutral bay car park to 320 stores at the peak. Different industries, same arc. Australian operator wins big. The win sets up the fall. Deluxe in 1988 was Cotties at the General Foods deal. Deluxe in 1988 was Dick Smith at the Woolworths peak. The market share was unprecedented. The fleet was the largest. The brand was the recognised name on the long-haul highways of the country. The workforce was 900 strong. The offices were on 5 continents, and the slogan was on every blue and white panel. Blue Ribbon Service, Australia's biggest coach company. The Sydney travel agent's idea had become the industry's standard, and then Roden made the decision that would, 2 years later, end the company. Chapter 6. The $12 million bet. In 1986 and 87, with Expo 88 looming and Deluxe expanding fast, Roden made the bet that built the empire and then killed it. The bet was on double-deckers. The Kessbohrer Setra Super Decker was a German-built 2-storey luxury coach, 80-plus passengers per unit. Twin-deck observation seating. Engineered to a European specification, no Australian operator had run on the long-distance interstate routes. The 1986 demonstrator, a single Setra that did a 20,000-kilometre Australian tour, was so impressive that Deluxe ordered 15 of them. Some sources record 16. The 1986 demo unit was later rebuilt and joined the fleet, making the count either 15 or 16, depending on how the demo is recorded. Each Setra cost 500,000 Australian dollars. To finance the order, Deluxe entered into what Gordon Lowe described as a $12 million financial arrangement with the Commonwealth Bank of Australia. $12 million for 16 German double-deckers about to enter a market that was about to shrink. It got bigger. Australian coach manufacturers had watched the Setra import order, with the same admiration and concern Australian car manufacturers had watched Toyota imports a decade earlier. A B. Denning and Company, the Brisbane coach builder, founded by Alan B. Denning, set out to build an Australian answer. The Denning Lancia double-decker, powered by a 400 horsepower Detroit diesel 8V92 TTA engine with an Allison HTB 748 transmission, would be the first long-distance double-decker built on Australian soil for Australian conditions. Deluxe ordered 20. The order was placed in 1987, provided A.B. Denning could build 20 units within 12 months, fleet numbers 180 to 200. The Australian arm of the double-decker bet would be larger than the German arm. Read that again. $12 million of borrowed money for 16 German double-deckers. 20 Australian double-deckers on order alongside them, on a 12-month production deadline. A coach fleet already operating at 150 units. A peak demand cycle just about to deliver Expo 88's 6-month cash bonanza. The bet structure was visible from any honest accountant's desk. The Cetras were premium-tier capital expenditure on a fare-cutting business. The Dennings doubled the same bet. The Commonwealth Bank facility was $12 million. The implicit gamble was that Expo 88's revenue surge would continue past 1988, that the interstate coach market would keep growing, and that no faster, cheaper alternative would arrive before the new fleet had paid for itself. If you watched our Dick Smith video, you saw Anchorage Capital strip Dick Smith Electronics using $10 million of the company's own money, taking cash out through a Cayman Islands shell. Deluxe was the inverse mechanism. $12 million of borrowed money put into the company to build the fleet that would kill it. Two paths to the same place. Two different ways an Australian brand gets destroyed by a financial decision. The Cetras began arriving in 1987. The first Denning Lancia double-decker for Deluxe, fleet number 181, body number DBL0003, entered service in April 1988. The fleet that would define Deluxe was now the fleet that would bury it. Chapter 7, The Double-Decker Empire, January 1988. Brisbane. Alan B. Denning's coach building operation completed the prototype Lancia double-decker, body number DBL0001. The first Australian-built long-distance double-decker coach sold to Victor Lindsay of Coffs Harbour, who operated a regional touring business. The first Deluxe Lancia double-decker rolled off the production line 3 months later. Fleet number 181, body number DBL0003, Deluxe livery 2 shades of blue, white belt. In April 1988, it entered service on the Eastern Seaboard Corridor. In July 1988, 3 months into service, fleet number 181 was photographed at Ulara, the visitor service township established beside Uluru in Central Australia. The image, preserved in the Driver Classics Heritage Fleet Archive, shows the coach in original Deluxe colours against the red soil of the Western Desert. It is one of the best surviving photographs of Deluxe Coachlines at its peak. A Sydney travel agent's idea, built in a Brisbane factory, photographed at Uluru. By the end of 1988, the German Cetras and the Australian Dennings were running across the network. The fleet had crossed 170 units. Expo 88 had delivered the cash. The blue and white was on every major interstate corridor in the country. But the late 1980s coach industry had a darker backdrop than Deluxe's expansion suggested. On Friday, 22nd December 1989, 8 months after Deluxe's first Lancia double-decker entered service, 2 coaches collided head-on at high speed on the Pacific Highway near Kempsey, New South Wales. One coach was operated by McCafferty's Coaches of Toowoomba. The other was operated by Trans-City Express. Both coaches were Denning Lancias, the same model class from the same Brisbane coach builder that Deluxe had ordered 20 of. 35 people were killed, 41 were injured. It remains, in the words of the Wikipedia summary, the worst road crash in Australia. If you watched our McCafferty's video, you saw the Kempsey crash handled with the respect the families of the dead deserve. We are not going to relitigate the crash here. What matters for this story is the industrial backdrop, the late 1980s Australian coach boom, the boom Deluxe had led, the boom that had filled the fleet expansion order books at AB Denning and Custom Coaches and Austral, and the others, produced the conditions in which 35 Australians died on a single Friday morning in late December. The Pacific Highway was rebuilt after Kempsey. The federal regulations on coach driver fatigue were rewritten. The trade press of the late 1980s carried obituary after obituary. The boom had a body count. Deluxe had not been operating the coaches at Kempsey, but Deluxe had built the demand pattern the industry was now meeting. The largest interstate coach company in Australia, running fares lower than ever, ordering more double-deckers than ever, had set the tempo. Kempsey was the dark adjacent of the same boom. The Wangaratta Depot, by late 1989, the largest concentration of long-distance coaching equipment in Australia, was full. The post-Expo demand surge was about to end. The Commonwealth Bank facility was about to come due. Chapter 8. The Compass That Came Too Late. The Expo 88 cash flow ended in October 1988, the day Expo closed. The 1989 financial year arrived with no Expo cash. The 1990 financial year was worse. Across 1988 and 1989, the Australian coach industry began to feel a structural shift in interstate travel the Expo surge had masked. Domestic airline competition was the issue. The Hawke government had begun the policy work of dismantling the two-airline policy, the regulatory arrangement that, since 1952, had kept Australian domestic aviation closed to all but Ansett and Trans-Australia Airlines. In 1989, the policy of opening domestic aviation to a third carrier was announced. The end of the two-airline policy was set for midnight on Tuesday, October 30th, 1990. Compass Airlines was preparing to launch with low-fare service on the major routes. The debt market noticed. Deluxe carried a $12 million Commonwealth Bank facility on the Cetra and Denning double-decker order. Post-Expo coach demand was falling. The ANZ Bank, also a Deluxe lender, was watching cash flow against debt service. By July 1990, the Commonwealth Bank moved to recoup what it could of the $60 to $70 million it was now owed. Deluxe's last service ran at midnight on Tuesday, August 28, 1990. The ANZ Bank foreclosed the same day. Coopers and Librand was appointed administrator on Wednesday, August 29th. 3 months and 3 days later, Compass Airlines launched. Read that again. Deluxe Coachlines collapsed on Tuesday, August 28, 1990. Compass Airlines flew its first commercial service on Saturday, December 1, 1990. The killer everyone has retrospectively blamed for the coach industry's late 1980s decline hadn't even started flying yet. How to destroy Australia's biggest coach company without help. Step 1. Cut fares for a decade until you have 50% of the national market. Step 2. Borrow $12 million to import 16 German double-deckers. Step 3. Order 20 more from a Brisbane coach builder on a 12-month deadline. Step 4. Watch Expo 88 close and demand fall. Step 5. Read the bank's foreclosure letter at midnight on a Tuesday. Read that again. The ACCC, looking back at airline deregulation, recorded that average airfares have fallen, in nominal terms, 8.7% since deregulation, and that the reduction in average fares was greatest during the period when Compass One was operating, with a 31.6% cut in nominal terms. The structural killer was real. The premium long-haul coach market would have collapsed under Compass regardless. But Deluxe had killed itself first, by debt, by speed, by the fleet that was supposed to define the company. If you remember the Ansett story, you'll recognise the pattern. Bailey's diversified Ansett into 37 companies. A decade after he stepped down, the company collapsed. Deluxe didn't diversify into 37. Deluxe just bought 36 double-deckers. Different scale, same hubris. If you watched our Point Henry video, you saw Alcoa announce the Geelong closure in February 2014, and the Abbott government blamed the carbon tax. Except Alcoa itself said the carbon tax was not a factor. Different industry, different killer, that wasn't. Same structural irony. Deluxe was killed by a debt arrangement on a fleet that was supposed to outpace a market that ended up shrinking around it. The killer everyone blames arrived too late to land the blow. Chapter 9. Midnight at Wangaratta, July 1990, 6 weeks before the end. The Commonwealth Bank moved to recoup what it could of the $60 to $70 million it was owed across the Deluxe fleet finance. The ANZ Bank, owed more than $15 million, was watching. August 1990. The financial position became untenable. Tuesday, the 28th of August, 1990. Midnight. The last Deluxe Coachline service ended. The fleet was rounded up to Wangaratta. Every Cetra, every Denning, every Domino, every Austral coach Deluxe owned rolled in from terminals across the continent. Parked at the depot Roden and McIntyre had built up over 11 years. Some sources put the September 1990 fleet at 193 coaches. Gordon Lowe recorded the peak operating fleet at 179. Either figure is what was now sitting idle at one Victorian country town. ANZ Bank staff arrived at the depot the same night. Regional television news that evening captured the scene. A clip preserved on the Deluxe Coachlines reunion Facebook page shows the coaches stored at Wangaratta and inside the depot, with a gathering of staff at an ANZ Bank presence on site. That image, rows of blue and white coaches parked nose to tail, ANZ Bank inside the office, is the death of Deluxe on camera. Coopers and Lybrand was appointed administrator the following morning. Wednesday, the 29th of August, 1990. The Canberra Times ran the story under the headline, ANZ forecloses on Deluxe. Thursday, the 30th of August, 1990. The Brisbane Courier Mail led the front page with coach firm owes $100 million. The penny exact numbers came out across the next 48 hours. Total debt approximately 100 million Australian dollars. ANZ Bank owed more than 15 million. Commonwealth Bank owed between 60 and 70 million. 280 Queensland Deluxe employees lost their jobs immediately. The Courier Mail recorded that hundreds of tourists were scrambling for seats on other carriers across the Australian capitals where Deluxe had been the dominant operator. And then something happened that does not happen in industrial collapses. The competitors helped. 8 other coach companies, operators who had spent 11 years being undercut by Deluxe's fares, honoured Deluxe tickets for a 24-hour period. The same coach industry that competed against Deluxe by day stepped in to carry its stranded passengers at midnight. The same drivers who had pulled into the same Port Augusta roadhouse beside their Deluxe counterparts, the same mechanics who had worked the same engines, the same depot managers who had taken bookings against the same fare schedules, those operators carried the passengers home. There is no equivalent gesture in the Holden story, in the Colonel story, in the Point Henry story. When industrial operators collapse, their competitors collect the customers. The coach industry collected the people. A former Deluxe staff member, posting decades later on the reunion Facebook page, wrote the line that captures what those 8 competitors knew about the workforce they were helping. Deluxe wasn't a job, the former staffer wrote, but a way of life. If you watched our Kernel video, you saw the last shift at Caltex's refinery in October 2014. 600 Australians walking out a gate operational since 1956. Kernel's last shift was a slow institutional ending across a decade of rundown. Deluxe's last shift was a single night at one depot, the entire national fleet parked under floodlight, the ANZ Bank inside the office. In November 1990, the administrator briefly resumed services on the Adelaide-Darwin-Perth corridor. The resumption lasted weeks. Final cessation followed. The blue and white was off the highways. For now. Chapter 10. The Ghosts on the Highway. The fleet fire sale began in September 1990 and ran through 1991. Coopers and Lybrand, the administrator, had assets to liquidate. 193 coaches, German Setras, Australian Dennings, Australian Customs, Australian Australs, most less than 3 years old, many less than 1 year. Premium long-distance equipment depreciated only by use, with a fire sale price operators across the country could not refuse. The buyers came from everywhere. Some came for one coach, some for two. Premier Stateliner of Adelaide took several. Moore's Tours of Hurstville took one. Australian Luxury Travel of Bonnyrigg took the first Denning double-decker deluxe had ever owned, fleet number 181, body number DBL0003, and operated it under TV 5000 through the 1990s. Moore's took fleet number 187, body number DBL0009, known to deluxe drivers as Daisy, under TV 5200. Premier Stateliner took 193 and 194 under VB, U442 and VBM 387. Langley's Coaches of Dubbo took fleet number 203, an Austral Minimaster, under TV 8354. The list ran for pages. Most operators did not repaint. The blue and white was so distinctive, 2 shades of blue, white belt, the deluxe wordmark on the side, that buyers found it cheaper to leave the livery alone. New paint costs money. A coach already painted, even in a dead company's colours, is a coach already painted. Run it. Earn it back. Repaint when the panels need replacing. For the next 10 years, well into the 2000s, the highways of Australia carried blue and white deluxe coaches, different operators, different fleet numbers, different drivers, same colours. A passenger boarding a coach in Adelaide for Alice Springs in 1997 might find themselves on a deluxe Denning double-decker, operated by a different company in original livery, 7 years after the company on the side had ceased to exist. We searched for a museum-preserved deluxe coach. We did not find one. The Sydney Bus Museum holds a Deluxe Coachlines item. It is a 1:76 scale die-cast model sold in the gift shop. It is not a preserved coach. The registration SAN257 does not appear to match any actual deluxe coach in the historic fleet records. The frequently cited Sydney Bus Museum preserved deluxe Denning is a die-cast. The honest accounting is that Deluxe died fast enough that no preservation movement had time to claim a hero artefact. The Denning double-deckers that survived in private operator fleets. The Setras went to wreckers or to outback operators. The Austral and Domino coaches scattered across smaller regional operators. No museum stewardship, no restoration society, no Lake Goldsmith rally for the coach industry. What survives is the reunion Facebook page, the 1993 Albury and 2010 Wangaratta gatherings, and Gordon Lowe's 2015 Viewmark Films documentary Deluxe Days, 25 years after the collapse, gathering interviews the 1990 trade press had not. If you watched our Kernel video, you saw the refinery site preserved as Australia's largest fuel import terminal, wharf still active. Kernel became a foreign fuel gateway. Point Henry became a paddock with a water tower. Deluxe became blue and white paint on other companies' coaches, and a Facebook page run by former staff. A company can be killed by debt. The colours sometimes survive. Chapter 11. The Bank That Survives Them All. 3 lessons. Lesson 1. The bus that builds the company is sometimes the same bus that buries the company. Deluxe bought its way to 50% market share with one hired Denning in 1979. Deluxe spent its way out with 36 double-deckers between 1986 and 1988. The first phase was disciplined undercutting. The second was borrowed money. The bus didn't change. The arithmetic changed. Lesson 2. Hubris kills you faster than your competitors do. Greyhound and Ansett Pioneer did not destroy Deluxe. Compass Airlines did not destroy Deluxe. Compass had not yet flown when Deluxe was foreclosed on. The coach industry did not destroy Deluxe. It kept Deluxe's passengers moving for 24 hours after the collapse. Deluxe destroyed itself with a fleet decision made at its peak market share on a $12 million Commonwealth Bank facility against a structural shift any honest accountant could have read in the deregulation papers. Lesson 3. The bank survives the company. Every time. ANZ Bank foreclosed on Deluxe at midnight on Tuesday the 28th of August 1990, owed more than $15 million. Greyhound and Ansett Pioneer continued operating. In 1993 to 1994, Greyhound Pioneer and Bus Australia folded into Greyhound Pioneer Australia. ASX listed, ticker GPA. In March 2000, McCafferty's of Toowoomba entered negotiations with GPA. In September 2000, the takeover bid was accepted. On the 28th of February 2001, GPA delisted from the ASX. Deal terms: 1 McCafferty share for every 3 GPA shares, plus 10 cents cash, 5 cents at 30 days, 5 at 6 months. Roughly 4,000 creditors owed $27 million were paid about $17 million. In October 2004, the McCafferty family sold its shares to ANZ Bank and George Chapman. Both operations were rebranded as Greyhound Australia. Read that one more time. ANZ Bank foreclosed on Deluxe on the 28th of August 1990. 14 years later, the same ANZ Bank owned Greyhound Australia, the successor to the industry Deluxe had spent 11 years competing against. The bank that killed the company that destroyed itself ultimately owned the company that replaced it. The pattern has not stopped. On the 4th of December 2023, Greyhound Australia was acquired by Entrada Travel Group, a New Zealand family-owned operator running Intercity in New Zealand. The acquisition added about 70 coaches. Entrada CEO, John Thorburn. Entrada is excited by the opportunity to bring the iconic and well-respected Greyhound brand into the family. Greyhound CEO, Dan Smith. This acquisition comes at a pivotal time. As the nation's sole national coach operator, we're poised for significant growth post-pandemic. In March 2024, Greyhound rolled out the first of 5 new coaches, a $3 million fleet investment. In August and September 2024, Entrada acquired Sid Fogg's Coaches of Newcastle. In 2025, Dan Alpi was appointed Group CEO. If you watched our Point Henry video, you remember the closing image, a water tower over cleared paddock at Geelong. Deluxe's closing image is different. Deluxe ended with a New Zealand family running the only national coach company left, a scattered fleet on other operators' books, and a Facebook page where former drivers still post photographs of the blue and white 40 years on. If you watched our McCafferty's video, you saw the Toowoomba family operate carefully for decades and exit cleanly in 2004. McCafferty's slow patience outlived Deluxe's fast empire by 14 years. Drive the Hume Highway today. Drive the Stuart. Drive the Eyre. You will see Greyhound coaches. They are owned by a New Zealand family. The blue and white is gone. But the lesson is on the next bus you board. The bank that survives the company has only just begun.